Archaeologists have discovered a mass grave at an ancient temple in North Peru. It contains the bodies of over 70 young men, brutally mutilated and dumped in a pit.
I thought about it and I thought, this is way too much work to do if you're butchering an animal.
Who were these people, and why were they so horribly mutilated? Archaeologists hope that with modern forensic techniques, they can find the answers.
In many ways, it looks like what you'd see in a war crimes case where they collected the young males and executed them.
In the foothills of the Andes lie the ancient ruins of the Huaca de la Luna, the Temple of the Moon. This is the home of the Moche, an ancient society, and the site of 70 gruesome murders. John Verano is a forensic anthropologist and one of the world's leading authorities on skeletal remains. He's helped on countless murder investigations. Now, Verano's task is to bring cutting-edge forensic science to solve the mystery of the mass grave in the heart of this ruined city. The Moche were a complex society who built some of the largest structures ever found in South America before they disappeared completely for over 1,000 years. Archaeologists didn't know they existed until this site was first uncovered just a century ago. There is still a great deal unknown about who the Moche were and exactly when they existed.
The dating of them, the beginning and end, is always a little bit vague, perhaps, but from around the time of Christ to about 800 AD, so around the time of Julius Caesar invading Britain to about the time that the Vikings took Lindisfarne. And they are occupying a number of valleys that come down into the north coast of Peru, where we've got basically desert coastline. So these valleys bring water and therefore provide the possibilities of life, of irrigation, of agriculture. And the Moche live in a series of these valleys, about 10 of these valleys running up the north coast of Peru.
What archaeologists uncovered at Huaca de la Luna told of an incredibly complex society. The Moche produced huge amounts of intricate pottery and sophisticated silver and gold work. But the evidence of the mass grave shows a much darker side to their culture.
It looks broken too there, but are those cuts? Ooh, they look like cuts. You see cuts? Yeah, the whole series of cuts. Right there and there and there. So there are going to be more things, more surprises under this guy, I'm sure.
All the skeletons from the mass grave show the same distinctive cut marks.
You can see here, there's a cut. So they were cutting them right there, right kind of in between the eyebrows. That probably was part of peeling the face off. By flaying the face, it exposed the eyes and other parts of the face to vultures. I think some of them were alive when they did this.
Verano hopes to find out who the victims were and who was responsible for these horrific acts.
It'd be a little like crucifixion. It would be a way to kill somebody in a really awful manner. But there are subtle things, but they're kind of spooky to think about.
To help find the answers, Verano's colleague Laurel Hamilton is making a detailed study of the injuries.
You just have skeletons coming out of the ground all over the place in these incredible mass graves, some of whom have only had their throat slit or have their head removed, a few cuts on their skulls, and then some of them that we've been finding that just are covered. Every single bone has multiple cut marks on it. What kind of tool were they using to deflesh and dismember the people? Based on quite a few criteria, for example, the straightness of the walls of the cuts, how fine and delicate they are, lead me to believe that the Moche were using metal tools. Now, whether or not they were using tumis, the crescent-bladed knives that you see on the pots, that I can't tell you for sure.
Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Moche left no written account of their culture. However, the images on the pottery graphically depict that there was a sinister side to Moche life.
Some of the scenes that appeared most fantastical in some ways were the scenes of human decapitation, limbs being removed, skin being taken off, blood being taken. And one of the questions was, were these real scenes? Were these things that actually happened, or were they, as was probably thought most commonly, mythical things, the depiction of what might have happened in the mythical past, if you like, of the Moche?
Millions of pieces of Moche pottery have already been unearthed. Many show macabre images of torture. So were these imagined or real? The answer was to come from a nearby tomb, found a short distance from the mass grave at Huaca de la Luna. Another team of archaeologists found a second burial site. It was completely different from the mass graves that Verano and his team are investigating. These graves were far more elaborate, containing a variety of artifacts that helped archaeologists identify the remains of the bodies.
The Moche had a practice of art mimicking life. On the pots, you see the warrior priest, the bird priest, the priestess. You found these tombs, and the people buried there have identical headdress, the identical goblet, and so forth that you see on the pots.
These graves appeared to show evidence of the murderers, the warrior priests shown on the pottery. If the people were real, then so were the events.
When you see people having their hair pulled back and having the toomey knife at their throat, I think that it's probably not too big of a step to assume that, yeah, they were probably using those toomeys to cut up the people in real life.
Based on the discovery of the warrior priests' tombs, Verano believes that the skeletal remains they were unearthing from the mass grave at Huaca de la Luna are the remains of the warrior priests' victims.
From the depictions of pottery, it appears that at the moment of sacrificing a prisoner, frequently blood was taken, and in the iconography at least, it seems that that is taken and put into a cup, and that cup is then given to the warrior priest.
It seemed that the bloodletting, slaughter, and even drinking of human blood were part of some gruesome mass ritual. One grave in particular captures Verano's attention.
All that we found here is 2 feet, a right and a left foot, so presumably from the same person, and this skull. It's a very unusual thing, and we can see around here that they broke through a block of adobes to dig a hole to put him here. So this is a very intentional burial of these parts. It looks like an offering or something under most contexts. Why they're doing it, I don't know, but one idea that I have is that perhaps these things still had ritual power, and you didn't want to just discard them. Whether that means they respect them or just means they're afraid of their power, I don't know. One of the two, perhaps.
To find out more about how he died, Verano takes the skull back to the lab for Laurel Hamilton to examine. But to find out what he actually looked like, they will reconstruct his face. A copy is made of his skull and sent to Sharon Long, a leading forensic artist.
Nice teeth.
Facial reconstruction is often used in murder cases to identify the murder victim. It's an extremely accurate technique to recreate the layers of muscle and skin.
This nose is really narrow.
In the hands of an expert like Sharon, the shape of the skull holds vital clues to his features.
I can see that this heavy overbite will make his front of his mouth jet out. It will jet out. He doesn't have really thick lips. He won't be a thick-lipped person because from gum to gum, it looks quite narrow.
The markers are of specific length, according to the thickness of muscle and skin at that point. Using clay, she will place the anatomically correct muscle groups between the markers to give the face its true shape.
You need to be precise. That way I have more confidence that this is going to come out looking like this person.
The accuracy of this technique shows us exactly what this murder victim looked like and might give Verano more clues as to where he came from. In Verano's lab, Laurel's analysis of the victim's skull is also beginning to yield answers about the kind of man he was.
He has several interesting things going on with him. The first one, and most obvious one, is this giant depressed area. This would be probably, most likely, from getting hit very hard on the forehead with a club. There's another real good one right at the top of his head that's fairly deep. Again, being hit by some sort of club. And then also, at some point, he broke his nose, and it also has healed over. This guy was probably a warrior.
Verano believes that the warriors found at Huaca de la Luna might be prisoners of war, captured, paraded, and executed by the Moche.
In many ways, it looks like what you'd see in a war crimes case where they collected the young males and executed them. The questions we ask are the same. How were these people killed? Were these wounds from combat? And clearly they were not. These people never went back to their villages. They never went back to their families.
In a small chamber close to the mass grave, a member of Verano's team thinks he's uncovered the exact place where their blood was spilled.
It's really dark brown stain. It looks like blood. Dried blood, you know how it turns purplish? You know, it looks like the main pouring was right here and splattered. You can see some dots there. But looking at this is blood, it would be similar to that's what they're drinking on the sacrifice scene. Something different is going on in this little area of this very clean, hardly ever used room. It's interesting to me.
With further investigation, Verano is able to date the use of the room to the same time as that of the mass graves.
Now, this whole area was covered with windblown sand. So this stuff is, and it's under about 10 or 15 feet of sand and sealed with an adobe floor. So there's no question that it's, it dates to the time of the use of the room.
With the evidence he has amassed, Verano has uncovered what looks like 6th century war crimes. The remains of 70 men, some as young as 15, lay in a jumbled mass dumped in a pit. He had identified the killers as the warrior priests, but who were these prisoners of war? John Verano, a leading forensic scientist, has been invited to examine an extraordinary mass grave discovered by an archaeological team on the coastline of northern Peru. He's unearthed disturbing evidence that the deaths of these young male victims over 1,000 years ago were brutal and, in modern eyes, cruel beyond belief. Forensic artist Sharon Long has completed the facial reconstruction of the skull that Verano found at Huaca de la Luna.
Every time you make it look just a little bit more real, you think, yes. It's good to have a person back with us.
Now it's up to Verano and Laurel to work out precisely how this young warrior died.
That's a great one. Oh, this is the one. Take a look at this. That's a cut. That's a cut.
Mm-hmm. That is a cut mark?
Yeah, that's a cut mark. So what do you think? I'm thinking that we've got two different things going on. They slit his throat.
Maybe they slit his throat first, and then they decided
And then
to
they
take his
decapitated
head
him.
off
And
later.
whoever is Mr. Decapitator has a different style. He's really,
Definitely
I mean, that's kind
more
of
power,
crude, isn't
less
it?
finesse, yeah.
There you go.
I don't think I've seen one that deep before.
I haven't
That's
either.
incredible.
You know, it's a great thing is I guess he finally got impatient and just pulled the neck back
Cracked
and
the whole,
snapped it.
snapped his neck
Snapped
off.
it off. And then they cut his feet off.
Yeah.
They really didn't like the guy. And then they put his feet right in front of his mouth. So not just a couple of feet, but a couple of cut off feet.
In amongst the remains on another of the victims, he's found a tiny fragment of hair.
This is cleaned off right here. There's some, puede ser pelo también. There's some traces of, it's hair. Traces of human hair, probably.
To a forensic scientist, this is like gold dust.
Very ephemeral stuff.
The fragment of hair may tell Varano where they came from and who they were. Everything we eat leaves a unique chemical marker in our hair. It's a bit like a fingerprint of our diet.
Whatever he was eating, it leaves a signature, a chemical signature, in the hair. You can tell whether somebody ate a diet rich in seafood or whether they ate a diet that was just terrestrial things like llamas, alpacas, corn. Yeah, oh, beautiful. There's a little mat of hair. Since we're right near the coast, if he was from this area, we would expect him to have at least some seafood in his diet. If he was from further inland, perhaps he wouldn't. So diet may give us a clue as to his origin.
In order to compare the samples, Varano also takes snippets of hair from local villages.
The
villagers in this area have eaten the same food and fished the same seas for hundreds of years. Their hair would leave much the same chemical marker as their ancient Moche ancestors. Varano sends these samples to geochemist Dr. Stephen Mako. He will compare the chemical markers from the hair samples Varano has collected.
We've completed analyses of these samples, and we have the analyses of the Moche.
What he's discovered is that the samples Varano collected from the local villagers were pretty closely grouped together and were what Dr. Mako expected to see from a community who lived off the ocean. He found that the samples from the victims' graves were also closely grouped together, but they were a significantly different set of results to those of the villagers. The victims had a different diet to the coastal inhabitants who lived near to Huaca de la Luna. They were not locals.
Were they a different group of people? Did they come from a different location? But from all appearances, one could say yes, they were. That they weren't part of the same Moche that were buried inside of the pyramids.
Armed with these results, Varano's convinced that the victims in the mass grave were prisoners of war from another valley, since they ate less seafood. However, it doesn't mean that they weren't Moche as well.
It has been suggested that these are in fact internal battles between groups of warriors within Moche society, rather than being a set of battles between Moche and other enemies, so to speak. Now, this obviously affects the significance of these offerings, whether they are seen as undesirable outsiders or as individuals who have given themselves, may have lost in the battle, but nonetheless were prepared to participate in the battle and give themselves over to being sacrificed.
So it is possible that the Moche fought, captured, mutilated and killed another group of Moche warriors. There is mounting evidence that the capture of the victims took place on enemy territory. Now Varano believes he's found the evidence to at last piece together the disturbing sequence of events which unfolded after the prisoners were captured.
I've seen people sacrificed before, so you get the wounds right at the time of death. But these things that are healing, I think, tell much more about the story of capture and how long somebody was alive before they finally sacrificed them. Makes sense in terms of the iconography because you see prisoners in Moche art being led back with ropes tied around their neck, being marched back from some other location. And the fact that these injuries are healing for a couple of weeks before the people were killed means that they were either parading them around or else bringing them from a distance. Gives you a feeling for how these guys must have suffered before they were finally killed.
We now have enough evidence, clear evidence of how they died. The slitting of the throat to collect blood in these sacrificial rituals.
What's more, Varano believes that after removing the skin of their victims, they left the muscles in place. holding the skeletons together like giant puppets to be displayed in a macabre dance of death.
It was clear that these bones had been intentionally defleshed. And I do think that the end product is a skeleton. They want an articulated skeleton for some ritual purpose.
The excavations at Huaca de la Luna have helped contribute to our transformation of the knowledge of Moche society and the world that they created. It has perhaps horrified us because of the fact that what were seen as potentially mythical or fanciful things on the pottery now appear to be reality, and we see them as basically like the ritualized killings of some serial killers organized at a society level. And to realize that these massive constructions of these pyramids were in direct relation to some of these scenes of sacrifice.
For a sophisticated people, the Moche practiced acts of unimaginable barbarity. Maybe the killing was part of their religion, designed to appease their gods, to bring them a plentiful harvest and continued success. For them, these brutal acts were vital to the survival of their civilization, no matter how great the human cost.
What I could imagine here would be prisoners being led up that main ramp, tied with ropes around their necks. They'd be naked. And priests would then parade them, or warriors would carry them up. They would then be taken to one space or another on that platform and sacrificed. Their throats would be slit, their bodies would be dragged off, defleshed, turned into trophies, and then eventually thrown down there in the sand and covered over.
What happened at Huaca de la Luna is now much clearer. The 70 young men thrown in the pits were prisoners of war, possibly victims from other Moche tribes. They were captured and brutally killed in a macabre religious ritual, unfortunate victims of a society fixated on violence.
In 1939, lured by rumors of a fantastic lost city, American explorer and diplomat John Lloyd Stevens hacked his way into the thick mountain jungles of Honduras. The rumors hinted of a great Maya city, full of great monuments and strange carvings, built and then abandoned long before the white man set foot on New World soil. But even the tall tales he had heard could not prepare Stevens for the ghostly presence that loomed up before him.
It lay before us like a shattered bark in the midst of the oceans. Her masts were gone, her crew perished. All was mystery, dark, impenetrable mystery.
What sophisticated race had built the elegant city which lay before him, still nearly intact? Where had they gone? Most perplexing of all were the strange, chaotic carvings that adorned the temples. Were they some sort of language? But here, as at other Maya ruins, their mystery remained impenetrable. The carvings defied translation, just as the pyramids resisted explanation. Stymied scholars resorted to imagination, sketching a picture of the Maya as a peaceful, contemplative people thriving under the watchful eye of wise astronomer priests.
The scholars were wrong, dead wrong. Today's archaeologists working in the jungles of Central America have come to know a quite different Maya. They've cracked their code and the ancient peoples have found their voice again. In the once mighty city of Copan, hieroglyphs speak of war, blood ritual, and human sacrifice. Who then were these people? And what apocalypse brought their great dynasty to its knees?
When I walked among its temples, I did not see a pile of stone, but I thought, Washaklahun Ubah Karwil built this. He dedicated that ball court. And I began to understand all of those works, not as the relics of a dead civilization, but as the fossils of the human beings, the minds of the people who had created them. Copan came alive.
When Linda Sheely first walked into the jungles of Central America back in the late 1960s, Maya scholarship was in its infancy. The Maya had tamed the rainforests, growing corn and cacao beans, much as their descendants do today. They built great cities at Tikal, Yaxchilan, Chichen Itza, and Palenque. They traded in precious stones such as jade, fashioned some of the finest sculpture in the New World, and built pyramids to rival those of the Egyptian pharaohs. Beyond that, there was still much to learn. Scholars had resorted to a wishful thinking that spoke more eloquently of their own times than those of the Maya.
From the period of the 1930s up through the 60s, the great scholars of the time, Morley, Thompson, and others, characterized Maya society as having basically two groups of people, a whole bunch of peasant farmers who supported a very tiny elite who spent their lives contemplating the stars and time and living in ceremonial centers that were filled once or twice a year during great ritual festivals. The picture that was drawn of the Maya is that they never had war, they never disagreed with each other, and one wonders how they got close enough to each other even to reproduce themselves through the common human means.
People clung to that idea tenaciously, and I think part of the reason for that is they were reacting to all of the excesses and the maladies of Western culture. You have to remember that their context was that of two world wars, where literally the whole world was involved in a deadly conflict.
They wanted a peaceful people. They wanted to know that someplace in the world there was a human community that lived without war and competition.
For 15 years, archaeologist Bill Fash and his colleagues have continued and expanded excavation techniques that allow them to reconstruct the monuments even as they dissect them. In the past, archaeologists at Maya sites had no choice but to dismantle the grand monuments, layer by layer, to get at older structures obscured by the more recent ones. But at Copan, the archaeologists have created a delicate labyrinth of tunnels through the ruins, leaving them virtually intact.
Since the building of the Acropolis was a matter of layers upon layers upon layers, or as some have commented, it's like boxes inside of boxes, the easiest way to get from one to the next is by the tunneling. The world of the tunnels is like three-dimensional. It's very different because you can go up, down, or sideways. You can move in every direction.
If we had to do a traditional archaeological excavation of the Copan Acropolis, we'd have to destroy half of everything we dug. But with tunneling, we're able to just do surgical strikes. It's as if we're doing arthroscopic surgery, and we can just go in there with just very small excavations to exactly the point we want and get a maximum of information for a minimum of disturbance to the archaeological site. The tunneling's been vital to understanding the history of ancient Copan. We have the hieroglyphs that tell us about the kings, but the tunneling tells us about the buildings that were constructed by each of these rulers.
We were one day away from giving up here. We had found the cut, and I took one look at it with my flashlight, and I could see femur fragments and some of the shell and the two stones, and it just clicked immediately that it was not only this huge chamber, but that it had to be something very important.
Through the tunneling, we've discovered a part of the offering that's actually placed above the tomb. This was a big surprise. We didn't think we were going to find any human figures here. It's the largest tomb we've ever found in Copan.
Clearly, these were the tombs of noblemen, perhaps kings, but their identities remain a mystery. If there are clues to the dead man's identity, they likely reside in the walls of Copan's monuments, in the hieroglyphs that for so long remained obstinately silent. But only in the last few years has the language come alive. For the first time in a millennium, classic Maya can be heard among the jungle ruins. And what is being spoken has radically altered our view of the people who wrote on these walls.
We went from talking about empty ceremonial centers which held only priests, basically, and people living in little hamlets on the outside who would come in on Sunday to peddle their corn, you know, to some large urban centers, to understanding the fact that these cities, like Copan, with over 20,000 people living with the same kind of pollution that we get today in our cities. We now understand that the Maya were really much more like everybody else's. They're much more human.
They were much more human than we had imagined them. With the breaking of the Maya code, the picture of these people as peaceful stargazers crumbled. The great kings of Copan led their people in bloody battles against their neighbors.
We know that the Maya were like any other, quote, civilized group of people. They had a lot of war. They had a lot of conflicts with their neighbors. They were always jockeying for position to see who could be the biggest and the most powerful ruler of his time. To be a great and virile king, you had to go out and impose your will on somebody else by the use of force. You can see this in the depictions here on this figure. There are upside-down human heads, shrunken heads actually, that are trophy heads, that are the bounty of war. You can even see the ropes that they use to tie these heads together.
The hieroglyphs tell again and again of human sacrifice and self-mutilation. But to the Maya, they ensured continuation of their cosmos.
The most sacred substance was human blood, especially a king's blood. Led in auto-sacrificial ritual was the greatest gift that a king could offer to the gods and to his ancestors. There are a number of sites where child sacrifices have been found. It was thought that the baby's tears would bring the rainwater from the sky. So a lot of sacrifice was oriented toward fertility, toward ensuring that the natural cycles took their course and that the harvest would be bounteous and the people would be happy.
There are two great acts that kings consistently presented in the public forum. One is the taking of captives. The other is the taking and the offering of the king's own blood in ritual sacrifice taken from the most sacred areas of his own body. For a male, the genitals. For the female and the male, it's the tongue. It's the place where human beings reproduce themselves and the place where speech is made, where meaning is communicated from one person to another. Bloodletting was the central act of piety. Now why? One kind of soul is called chulel. It is a sacred living substance that is in our bodies that is never destroyed. It's passed on from you to future generations. That kind of soul resides in human blood. So that when kings give victims of war in sacrifice, or when they take blood for themselves, they are all giving the most potent and the most important, valuable substance on the face of the earth. Our culture says the same thing. What do we say? Greater love hath no man than he give his life for his brother.
Bloodletting marked each celebration in the calendar and each rite of passage in the life of the Maya. The birth of a child, the consecration of a temple, the preparation for battle, and the thanksgiving for victory. Our sport was fraught with cosmic importance. Copan's magnificent ball court, one of the best preserved in the Maya world, witnessed intricate morality plays in the guise of athletic competition.
The ball was seen to represent the passage of the sun in the sky, and much of the ball game was oriented toward ensuring the safe and timely passage not only of the sun through the sky, but of the moon and the planets and so forth.
The ball game is the fundamental metaphor of what life was. In this myth, two hero twins go to the other world. There, they confront the lords of death. Disease, starvation, warfare, all of the confrontation is played out in the ball court.
The king dressed up to play ball, embodying the forces of good, and he faced players who were dressed up to embody the forces of evil. So that when the king would defeat those people, he was in fact defeating all the things that could hurt his people.
In this competition of life over death, the losers sometimes paid the ultimate price.
Oftentimes there are very clear depictions of the sacrifice of ball players. In fact, sometimes they even bind the losers up as a ball and show them being rolled down steps just like these. So we do know that some people were sacrificed in order to ensure the victory of the forces of good ended in the sacrifice of a loser.
For hundreds of years, the blood pact between the kings of Copan and their subjects seemed to have stood them in good stead. Copan flourished. By 600, Copan and her sister cities were unrivaled centers of art and learning. From among the 15,000 works of Copan art collected here in the last decade, art historian Barbara Fash finds the works created during 18 Rabbits' reign particularly beautiful.
The buildings may have served a function that was utilitarian, but the iconography on the outside of it, the sculpture that was being produced at that time, just raised it to an artistic, aesthetic height that is really unprecedented in Copan and in many other places in the Maya area.
In the history of the Renaissance, not very many people know the name of the Pope Julius, but Julius was the man that commissioned Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo to leave us one of the greatest artistic heritages of the West. 18 Rabbit was the great patron of Copan, and he hired, commissioned, and gave the room to work to some of the greatest artists the Mayas ever had.
18 Rabbit ruled for 43 years. His sculptures, replete with themes of fertility and abundance, speak of a period of peace through strength, giving no hint of the disaster to come.
Rabbit is in the guise of First Father, the maize god, and he is the creator of the universe. He and his wife, who was the moon and First Mother, wear the netted skirt. That whole myth is contained in the life cycle of a piece of a maize tree. The little seeds that are put in the ground are called skulls and little bones. And when the maize tree sprouts from the ground, it's the rebirth of the maize god, and it's the rebirth of humanity, because that is the last act before the creation of this universe.
In 738, an aging 18 Rabbit set out on one more conquest to do away with a troublesome neighbor. He was captured and beheaded, an earth-shattering blow to his people. This is the great hieroglyphic stairway of Copan, begun not long after 18 Rabbit's gruesome death. The longest and most ornate inscription in the New World, the Grand Stairway records the complete history of the Copan dynasty. Its magnificent present testifies to a society quickly recovering from the blow of a great king's death. But the excavations reveal a more ominous story.
One of the most telling things about this monument is that even though it makes all these wonderful and grandiose claims, it was actually one of the worst constructed buildings in the entire city. The fill underneath this magnificent facade was the weakest they ever put inside of a building in Copan. That lets us know that the people who were building this pyramid were not nearly as enthusiastic about its message as the king who commissioned it.
As more and more kingdoms established themselves, they wanted their piece of the pie. And it led to a lot of internal strife that often was resolved in battle.
So first we see a weakening of the central order. Second is the actual collapse of the monarchical system of government. And that's literally all she wrote. There are no more monuments going up in Copan.
Copan had gone from a thriving, peaceful center of art and commerce to a valley of desperate people struggling to feed themselves. For physical anthropologist turned forensic detective Rebecca Story, the bones of Copan yield a grim prognosis.
Most of them probably died of the results of the overpopulation. That is, malnutrition and infection worked together to kill many children, and even the adults that survived eventually ended up dying of the effects of infection. By the time this individual was there, the population of the valley was probably in steep decline.
Some 20,000 people were hungry or sick, in the valley of Copan. How could it have happened that this thriving metropolis was reduced to this?
They set up the city on the most fertile agricultural lands, down on the bottomlands that the river had carved out and made fertile over the centuries. By doing so, they were basically cutting off their own food supply. They weren't able to farm the best lands. They were then obliged to cut down the forest on the slopes. In doing so, that caused erosion. As they had to cut back even higher up, this made for deforestation on a large scale that prevented the rain clouds from coming into the valley. And they provoked the collapse of the central authority first, but they also provoked the long-term abandonment of the valley because people simply couldn't get enough to eat here anymore.
The evidence suggests that the city grew rank with its own waste, that there was not a tree standing within 25 miles, and that the overworked soil could not begin to feed the hungry multitudes who lived there. Copan had become a victim of its own success.
For nearly 1,000 years, the kings of Copan upheld a blood covenant with their gods and their people. The Maya prospered. They built great monuments, deciphered the heavens, created objects of great beauty. But when their world began to collapse, even the blood of kings could not forestall disaster. In just a generation, the monarchy stumbled. Soon the great city would lie empty, reclaimed by the jungle.
Most of us who deal with the Maya think Maya civilization either ended at the collapse in the 9th century or it was destroyed by the Spanish invasion. But in fact, there are millions of Maya who still live in this worldview. It's still alive, it's still active, it's still incredibly productive. And what they have found is that the actions of their lives have roots that go back 3,000 years. And for our people who have been told that they are the ersatz leftover folk Catholic product of a European power, and that they have no value in themselves and they have no history, to have the glyphs put back in their hands is a miracle. And they say it is.
Today, with the hieroglyphs pouring out their stories, Copan is yielding a rich human history.
It's important to recognize and absorb the fact that one of the oldest, continuous, and most detailed written histories of the human species is Maya, and it is written on those stones.
You feel attached to the bones that are here, you know, you feel attached to the monuments that are here. They're ancestors, you know, they're still a part of our history, you know, and we're not excavating somebody else's, we're excavating our own history. This is of significance to our own people. It's unraveling the roots of our nation. I was only going to be here for a year, and I've been here 15, so to say how long, I think I'm going to stay for a long time. Copan is in my blood.
Who built some of the largest structures ever found in South America before they disappeared completely for over 1,000 years. Archaeologists didn't know they existed until this site was first uncovered just a century ago. There is still a great deal unknown about who the Moche were and exactly when they existed.
The dating of them, the beginning and end, is always a little bit vague, perhaps, but from around the time of Christ to about 800 AD, so around the time of Julius Caesar invading Britain to about the time that the Vikings took Lindisfarne. And they are occupying a number of valleys that come down into the north coast of Peru, where we've got basically desert coastline. So these valleys bring water and therefore provide the possibilities of life, of irrigation, of agriculture. And the Moche live in a series of these valleys, about 10 of these valleys running up the north coast of Peru.
What archaeologists uncovered at Huaca de la Luna told of an incredibly complex society. The Moche produced huge amounts of intricate pottery and sophisticated silver and gold work. But the evidence of the mass grave shows a much darker side to their culture.
It looks broken too there, but are those cuts? Ooh, they look like cuts. You see cuts? Yeah, the whole series of cuts. Right there and there and there. So there are going to be more things, more surprises under this guy, I'm sure.
Archaeologists have discovered a mass grave at an ancient temple in North Peru. It contains the bodies of over 70 young men, brutally mutilated and dumped in a pit.
I thought about it and I thought, this is way too much work to do if you're butchering an animal.
Who were these people, and why were they so horribly mutilated? Archaeologists hope that with modern forensic techniques, they can find the answers.
In many ways, it looks like what you'd see in a war crimes case where they collected the young males and executed them.
In the foothills of the Andes lie the ancient ruins of the Huaca de la Luna, the Temple of the Moon. This is the home of the Moche, an ancient society, and the site of 70 gruesome murders. John Verano is a forensic anthropologist and one of the world's leading authorities on skeletal remains. He's helped on countless murder investigations. Now, Verano's task is to bring cutting-edge forensic science to solve the mystery of the mass grave in the heart of this ruined city. The Moche were a complex society.
It's the crescent-bladed knives that you see on the pots. That I can't tell you for sure.
Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Moche left no written account of their culture. However, the images on the pottery graphically depict that there was a sinister side to Moche life.
Some of the scenes that appeared most fantastical in some ways were the scenes of human decapitation, limbs being removed, skin being taken off, blood being taken. And one of the questions was, were these real scenes? Were these things that actually happened, or were they, as was probably thought most commonly, mythical things, the depiction of what might have happened in the mythical past, if you like, of the Moche?
Millions of pieces of Moche pottery have already been unearthed. Many show macabre images of torture. So were these imagined or real? The answer was to come from a nearby tomb found a short distance from the mass grave at Huaca de la Luna. Another team of archaeologists found a second burial site. It was completely different from the mass graves that Verano and his team are investigating. These graves were far more elaborate, containing a variety of artifacts that helped archaeologists identify the remains of the bodies.
The Moche had a practice.
All the skeletons from the mass grave show the same distinctive cut marks.
You can see here and there's a cut, there's a cut. So they were cutting them right there, right kind of in between the eyebrows. That probably was part of peeling the face off. By flaying the face, it exposed the eyes and other parts of the face to vultures. I think some of them were alive when they did this.
Verano hopes to find out who the victims were and who was responsible for these horrific acts.
It would be a little like crucifixion. It would be a way to kill somebody in a really awful manner. But there are subtle things, but they're kind of spooky to think about.
To help find the answers, Verano's colleague Laurel Hamilton is making a detailed study of the injuries.
You just have skeletons coming out of the ground all over the place in these incredible mass graves, some of whom have only had their throat slit or have their head removed, a few cuts on their skulls, and then some of them that we've been finding that just are covered. Every single bone has multiple cut marks on it. What kind of tool were they using to deflesh and dismember the people? Based on quite a few criteria, for example, the straightness of the walls of the cuts, how fine and delicate they are, lead me to believe that the Moche were using metal tools. Now, whether or not they were using tombs of art mimicking life, On the pots, you see the warrior priest, the bird priest, the priestess. You found these tombs, and the people buried there have identical headdress, the identical goblet, and so forth that you see on the pots.
These graves appeared to show evidence of the murderers, the warrior priests shown on the pottery. If the people were real, then so were the events.
When you see people having their hair pulled back and having the toomey knife at their throat, I think that it's probably not too big of a step to assume that, yeah, they were probably using those toomeys to cut up the people in real life.
Based on the discovery of the warrior priests' tombs, Verano believes that the skeletal remains they were unearthing from the mass grave at Huaca de la Luna are the remains of the warrior priests' victims.
From the depictions of pottery, it appears that at the moment of sacrificing a prisoner, frequently blood was taken, and in the iconography at least, it seems that that is taken and put into a cup, and that cup is then given to the warrior priest.
It seemed that the bloodletting, slaughter, and even drinking of human blood were part of some gruesome mass ritual.